Welcome to the Break Your Bullshit Box podcast, where excuses aren't tolerated and results are earned through authenticity, vulnerability, and a commitment to excellence. My name is Amber Fuhriman, success architect, attorney, and NLP trainer. If you're ready to bitch slap the bully in your brain, overcome the bullshit that holds you back, and design the life and success you've always wanted, then it's time for you to break your bullshit box and step into designing life and success on your terms. Doug, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me.
I am super excited. So I'm going to be honest, I finished your book like 12 hours ago.
All right,
good. It took me a couple of weeks to get through because it is intense.
Very intense.
But it was also super, super interesting. So I'm going to preface this before we dig in that anybody who's interested in true crime, I think your book is incredibly interesting for. And it's definitely not for the faint of heart. It is an intense topic for sure.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that.
I'm sure reading the book, I thought it was an intense topic, but living it had to be even more intense. How do you prepare yourself for situations like this?
Yeah, I think just, that cop mentality, being 25 years in law enforcement, just you go through it every day. So it's not that it becomes second nature, but you just deal with whatever's in front of you. So I enjoyed it. I enjoyed writing it. The reason why I wrote the book is because I would tell these stories at office parties or, Christmas parties or wherever, and people would really want to know the details on the deviant sex crimes. Mm-hmm. So that's where the book came from, because they were so interested in it. I was like, I'm going to write a book, and then I did.
There's something throughout all of society about knowing and talking about things that we're not supposed to know and talk about, right? And I think that's so important for people to understand, because we get this almost thrill from feeling like we're doing something that's taboo when it's really just a part of society, unfortunately.
Yeah, there's no question. I reference that you always want to know what your next door neighbor does, what your boss does, what your best friend does behind closed doors. This book kind of leads you through that. So it gives you an eye-opening onto what somebody else might do. And really, it's the book's, it's sexually based, but it's about power, because these acts are about power. They're not really about the sex. I mean, it's certainly biological, but it's really about the power on these criminals, on the acts that they do. And I think that's what people find fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we dig into the book a little bit more, a cop in Alaska, man, I did not know that Alaska was so much of the wild frontier until I started reading your book and looking into crime in Alaska. It's a rough place.
Yeah, it's the most beautiful place on planet Earth, but also one of the most deadliest. So per capita, we have the most serial killers on planet Earth. Not a good thing to have in Alaska, but I think it's just so wild and free that it attracts that mentality that they can come up and there's so much land and they might be able to get away with everything they want. But they don't realize we have very sophisticated law enforcement, and it's only a matter of time before they're caught.
What made you decide to go into law enforcement?
Well, I was born in Homer, Alaska. It's a really small town of about 5,000 people. And then we moved to Anchorage, which is the largest city in Alaska. And I grew up there. I went to school there. I wanted a job that wasn't like office-based. I like adrenaline. I like to do different things. So really law enforcement kind of keyed in with me, something I wanted to do. I remember meeting a law enforcement officer as a small kid, and it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. So I just always thought someday I want to do that. So I applied with the Anchorage Police Department and the Alaska State Troopers simultaneously. They're our largest law enforcement agencies. APD, the Anchorage PD, hired me first, and then a week later, the troopers hired me. But I'd already taken the job, so then I spent my 25 years in Anchorage and surrounding areas.
Okay. And was there ever a point where you're in this career, you've gone through the academy, you've gone through training, that you're like, holy crap, maybe this is not the career for me? Or did it always feel aligned with what you wanted to do?
Yeah, not even a split second of regret. It was so interesting, and law enforcement changes every single day. The cases you work, the crimes that you work, that I was always fascinated with it. I always wanted that solved, to catch that criminal, to help the community. So never got bored, always changing it up, which I thought was cool. Never regretted a second. I would do it all over again if I had a second chance.
Yeah, I think you and I talked about this a little bit before you came out and we were doing the pre-interview. As a criminal defense attorney, I have such respect for law enforcement. And people often think that criminal defense attorneys and law enforcement are always on the opposite side of things. But we have so much in common, and we deal with the same type of bullshit day in and day out that sometimes we're the only people that get each other, right? Like you can't talk about this in public circles every day. And then we end up with this really warped sense of humor because if you don't laugh, you cry. And sometimes we're the only ones that get it.
Yeah, that's no doubt. Criminal defense attorneys in Alaska were some of my best friends.
Yeah.
We get together at parties. We talk all the time. As a matter of fact, they would always say, "Hey, Fifer, how you doing?" in our formal positions, and I would say, "Just busy planting evidence." It was a joke between us, and they would laugh because obviously I'm not planting evidence,
Yeah.
but we go back and forth. So that camaraderie, because they understand what we go through, we understand what you go through.
Yep.
And same on the prosecutorial district attorney side. Friends with them, everybody's really dealing with the same thing,
Yeah.
and sees the darker side of humanity, and does their job to help them in whatever way they can.
I think it's such an interesting thing, an important thing to talk about because the media does such a good job at putting us at opposite ends of a spectrum and making it seem like we're always fighting. But the reality is, as a criminal defense attorney, like I think we could all agree that some of my clients don't deserve to be out on the street, right? And there was certainly, people always ask me as a criminal defense attorney, how do you possibly do your job? And I'm like, in all reality, when you're talking the worst of the worst, my job isn't to keep them out of prison. My job is to keep them alive and life in prison, right? When we're talking about getting people off for a crime, we're talking about like small drug shit, right? The stuff that people look at and say, how could you defend somebody for like killing another person? Well, very rarely am I getting that person off without consequences. It's a conversation about how do I make sure that the punishment fits the crime, right?
Yeah, and I think that's what everybody wants. Even cops, I never sweat the small stuff. Mm-hmm. So if you were on an opposing case with me and it was a small drug charge and they got probation or something, the prosecutor, district attorney would always ask me, "You're okay with that?" Not really my choice, but certainly I'm okay with it if there's a path forward to fix that. Now, you go out and kill 5 people.
Maybe not so much.
Yeah, maybe not so much, but Anchorage was a great place to work because we were interactive with our prosecutors. We gave our input, and that's the way I raise my kids: is never sweat the small stuff because it's so menial in the large picture that it really doesn't matter. Get somebody some help if they've had a hiccup, and prevent them from going to those larger crimes. Cops are all for that.
I think it's an important conversation to have, though, because a lot of people tie their identity to their careers. And when you do that, it's so easy for you to believe that not getting the outcome you want in court is a direct reflection of you as a human being. And those are the ones that I see the most amount of pushback from when I'm dealing with people. Individuals like yourself, that you've built this life outside of law enforcement, right? It's a job. You have a job to do. And as long as you do your job to the best of your ability, the outcome is outside of your control. That is a super healthy place to be. What advice do you have for people who maybe might be at the beginning of their career, or they've tied their identity to this idea of people getting arrested and going to jail, to kind of separate that and say, you did your job, you got to let the rest go?
Yeah, I was a field training officer for many years, so I would take the new recruits and they'd ride with you for a month or two, and then you mentor them and check them off, make sure they could do their job. And again, I would tell them, one, we work for the taxpayers, which are also criminals who get indicted, so we work for everybody, and our ultimate goal is to keep the community safe. So if the outcome is a probation or something where they're monitored, it's still keeping the community safe. And again, we focus on the larger. There's a lot of big crimes that we can focus on. So do that. Don't worry about the small individuals. In my career, I'd make fun of traffic cops because I was always fascinated that you'd want to rain tickets down upon citizens, right? That's not really our job. So I was a warning cop, right? I would stop you, give you a warning, say slow down. I thought that was much more effective. Again, the larger crimes, we'll handle them the way we're supposed to. But I think that builds community rapport as well, because they understand that you're working with law enforcement. They're not actively out looking for you for some unknown reason. And the Anchorage Police Department is really a top-notch police department in that aspect. Very community friendly, go to events, organizations. We didn't, I call it hammer. We didn't hammer individuals for no reason. We focus on the larger crimes in our community, which bodes well for everybody.
Yeah, I think I've always looked at small like traffic stops and things like that as kind of the determination of whether there's something bigger that needs to be discussed, right? If there's not, and especially in Vegas, we have a huge drunk driving problem. We have 24-hour access to alcohol, and so there's a lot of people getting stopped. And as soon as the cop realizes they're not drinking, warning, and on your way you go, right? I had a really good friend of mine who was on a drug task force in Atlanta. And we were talking about this one day. I'm interested to hear your opinion on this from your standpoint. He pulled somebody over one day, And in Atlanta, they obviously have a large African-American population and Black population. And he pulled him over. They were speeding. He wanted to make sure they didn't have drugs in the car. That's all he was checking for. And on the way, they would go. And he walked up to the window, and there was some teenagers in the back. It was all teenagers in the car. There were teenagers in the back, and one of them was like hyperventilating and crying, and all she could get out is, "Please don't shoot me." And he's a white cop, and he says, "This was the moment that I started thinking I needed to get out of law enforcement, because if this is the narrative that I'm fighting against, how am I ever going to make the impact that I want to make?" I know this is a super deep and in-depth conversation, but with where we're at right now of the media being so fear-mongering heavy, how do we start to repair the relationship between police and the public and fight the societal generations of stereotypes?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I don't have a quick solve, but I have some ideas. And certainly we did those in our own community. Is one, for that officer to think about his career and maybe opting out. Just opposite, I would opt more in, because now you really have a defined job to do, is to make those relationships, doesn't matter the minorities, across the board, and treat everybody equally. Again, Anchorage does a wonderful job at that. We have very little of those incidents because we're so in depth with our community, attending events, cultural events, everything. I think that's important. Again, on those stops, the media doesn't do us any justice from law enforcement. You can go to the FBI, and everybody's welcome to go to their website, and you can look at officer-involved shootings with minorities. The fallacy that they put out, the numbers just simply aren't there. It's an extremely low percentage. Now, I agree, 0% would be the best, but law enforcement by far shoots minority suspects and victims than minority. But the media puts it out just opposite. So it is frustrating, but I think the way to get around it is, one, make your police department retrospective of your community, right? Having all minorities in your police department is key. Have them interact culturally with your community, and then build those relationships. It takes time, nothing's quick, but I think it's easily fixed, and the community supports you when you do things like that. Yeah. They get on board. I've never worked in Atlanta. It's a much larger city than Anchorage, but those are some of the things we did in Anchorage, and it works very well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think we as a population have a duty as well to say that we actually want to repair this relationship, right? I train and deal and live in human behavior when I talk about business owners and what causes us to believe what our capabilities are in a business environment. And a lot of those are passed down generationally. And I had a student of mine 2 years ago when they had the opportunity to say what their biggest takeaway was from the training that we spent time with. He said, "I just realized that generational curses are just generational beliefs, and I get to decide when I'm no longer going to believe it." And I think that, we have a duty as humans, not just in reaction to or in relation to law enforcement, but in relation to every part of our lives, to step back and say, like, what evidence do I have that maybe this narrative that I've written about this scenario is not accurate, and what could it actually be instead?
Yeah, I love that. I wish more people did it. Because if you really look around and think about it, most of your interactions with law enforcement are going to be positive. But it's like anything. If you go to a store or a restaurant, you had bad service, you're going to tell 10 people. If you have good service, you may tell one. Yeah. So it's the same thing with law enforcement. It's a constant battle, but I think that everybody steps back, looks. I recommend highly in the book that people go on ride-alongs in local departments. Any citizen can do it. You call them up, you can ride part way of a shift, all the shift, see what they do day in, day out. Sometimes it's not pretty. It's no excuse for law enforcement. I always a little bit jaded on their side because I worked it for so long. I know what goes on each day, how hard it is to interact with the community positively every single interaction, because you got 40 or 50 a day. And these are people at their worst times in life. Nobody typically calls us to say, hey, thank you. So it can be stressing on police. It takes a great cop to maintain their composure throughout it all, and that's the way it should be. But go on ride-alongs and see what they do before you start bitching about their job. Yeah. It really will enlighten you. And every person I took on a ride-along was like, wow, I had no idea. I knew some of the stuff went on. I didn't know it was this busy in our community.
Yeah, I think that that's a good point because, especially even with social media being what it is, a little bit more we're seeing the positive come out. But for the most part, what you're seeing is like, look at this bullshit side. And so you can have a cop that has 49 good interactions, and then he has a human moment where maybe he loses his cool. And that's the thing that's going to get played out in the media. And I think it's important to realize that we're human beings, right? Like, you're not a freaking robot that doesn't let anything get to you. In fact, you have a spot in the book where you talk about like the medics actually having to take care of you, because you're like, we're trained to deal with this, but shit still gets to you. So it was such an interesting moment to hear you in the book talk about these human moments of, I had to collect myself because some of the shit we see is so bad. Like, I didn't think it could get that bad, right?
Yeah, it's one of the rare times where I was getting lightheaded from a traumatic injury I saw, which is, you know, you go through those 100 times and there's no problem. But this one time there was a problem. But the injury is so extreme, I was like, wow. I mean, I got a little dizzy and dazed. I brought my composure back, but I would never thought that morning that would happen to me.
Yeah.
And so you got to recover and move on. So I think it's good. People, if they looked at everything that law enforcement does, they'd be like, wow, overwhelmingly a good job. When you hear about a bad cop, I do remind people that whether you're an attorney, you're a doctor, you're an oil executive, you work for Microsoft, you also have bad people in your organization. Yeah. It's a small percentage, and I wish we had none. But really, as a profession, 99% of your cops are solid and good. It's that 1%, just like every other profession, that you see and drags it down. That's not the common. The corruption that you hear and things like that is certainly not common. As a matter of fact, most cops would never put up with that.
Yeah.
We would stop it in our own department. Just simply wouldn't be acceptable. I come from an Alaska standpoint, which is a very cohesive department. You know, I'm not saying there was never corruption, but very little. Again, if we saw it, we would turn you in. It's not a department where we're just going to look the other way. So I come from a different perspective. I know that some other departments have issues that they have to work on, but overall, I think the profession's pretty solid.
Have you ever dealt with this situation where, and maybe not yourself, but somebody that you know, dealt with a situation where you see somebody in this revolving door of law enforcement contact? As an example, I had a client that I took to court, and the judge knew he got a haircut. And I was like, if the judge knows you cut your hair, you're here way too much. Like, this is way too much. And they're not able, like, you're not able to make a conviction stick. And it's so easy to go to that, well, I know I can get them for something conversation. How do you combat that as an officer to say, like, I know he's done so much shit that he's gotten away with, and I need to make sure that I color within the lines here, but it would be so easy to just get him for something. How do you combat that and go home at night and feel good about yourself?
Yeah, and hopefully if he's, you know, I've had people with 70 plus arrest and very few conviction. That's hard to do, right? That's a lot of arrest. But what I think we typically will have mental health court, we'll have other courts, and direct them towards there with the prosecutor, get them some help there. Obviously, drugs and alcohol are a huge problem. Yeah. So if they need some help, get them into those programs. If they don't last long in those programs or don't do well, they'll come out, they'll naturally commit a crime. So there's no instance where an officer would have to profile or look for them. Yeah. They're going to do it again, and we'll catch them, and then we'll handle that at the appropriate time. But I like the add-ons in court where you put them somewhere else except for jail. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you, and I reference in my book, jail's not a place where you get better or get healthy.
Right.
Prison, some of these prisons, most of them actually harm you in your mental capacity to come out and be a productive citizen. We probably need to reform that whole thing, to be honest with you. Way above my pay grade, obviously. But I think there's some programs out there that really work and can help individuals. If you get into murders or serial killers, that's one thing. Yeah. But most of them, if you did a burglary, a robbery, certainly you can be rehabilitated. So I'm really pro that, to give the individual a chance, just as I'd want the chance if I did it. So the court systems, and they need to get better with that. And it's a long process, and I don't have an easy answer, but there's some work to be done.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. And I don't have an easy answer either. You know, we have an incredible veterans court here in the Vegas and Henderson area that does just such an incredible job. You know, I had a poor client, it broke my heart, that kept getting arrested for burglaries because he had PTSD, and the only thing that would calm his PTSD down was putting Legos together. So when he was in the middle of a panic attack or a PTSD episode, he would go into a Walmart, sit in the middle of an aisle, and put stuff together, and theft prevention kept arresting him for stealing.
I'm never
right? And so we ended up getting him into a veterans program, and it's great. I agree with you that these reforms need to happen. I don't know how we make it happen because it's a big project, right? We've got to start somewhere. But I think the bigger issue, and the one that's harder to solve, is that we can't help somebody who doesn't want help, right? And so often people, even though we look at it and we're like, how are these 70 arrests not rock bottom for you? They haven't hit rock bottom yet. I mean, I don't know that there are options. I was going to ask you what the options were, but I don't know that there are, because until they're ready to take accountability and make some changes, there's nothing that we can do for them. And so prison ends up being the place they get housed. And you're right. Nobody comes out of prison a better person than they went in.
Yeah, and there's been all kinds of programs to try and force the help, but you're right. Unless you're going to accept the help and do it, boy, it's almost impossible. So then prison becomes the safety net for them, and they go in and they go out. But then it's a lifelong prison sentence, right? You might be out for a little while, you go back and you're a career criminal, which is what we don't want. I think there is a certain percentage, and it may be mental health or some, that it's hard to save, just to be honest with you, right? People ask law enforcement with homelessness, how do we fix this? Well, I don't have a great answer. Homeless people, they've been around since the beginning of mankind. They've tried all type of programs. Again, unless you want to help yourself, it's very difficult. So some of those, gosh, I wish I had an answer. It's just tough.
Yeah, it is. It's almost an impossible problem to solve, right? And unfortunately, the people that we can help can get kind of caught in the wayside. But I think, there's this accountability section, because I think this idea of probation, and, I've never represented somebody on their first time offense that doesn't get probation unless it's an intense crime, right? And so you have this opportunity for probation, but oftentimes they're still so stuck in the victimhood of being in that situation in the first place. Their probation officer's an asshole. The ego's in the way. They're not going to let them tell them what to do. When in reality, I think that being on probation is kind of like boot camp for the military, right? Like, you've got some habits that we need to kick, and we have a short period of time to do that. And we're kind of going to break it down a little bit in order to start to build you back up. And a lot of people can't handle the breakdown phase because they get into this like fuck you element, right?
Yeah, and I like that breakdown phase, because you're being afforded an opportunity to correct your life. And there's education, there's jobs, there's a lot of housing that they give them. So you got to step up a little bit on your own. So it is frustrating when they don't step up and they're using that, and then they use excuses. So as a cop, I would give tough love to criminals all the time. I'd be like, if I've arrested you 5 times, if you put the effort into life, you'd probably be very successful. But you don't. You take the easy way out each time. And some it worked with and some it didn't. So I wasn't a fixer of everything, but it didn't hurt to try. As we're driving to jail, I would get into their psyche and say, hey, what's going on with you? Let's stop this. And again, I go back to drugs and alcohol predominantly drives our system of criminal justice. It's unfortunate and so pervasive and so easy to get that I always wanted to wipe out the drug trade, which is virtually impossible. That would help a lot, wouldn't cure everything, but I think that's, they fall into that habit again, and it's hard to come back from that.
It is. You mentioned in your book that alcohol, we don't even think of alcohol as a drug anymore, unfortunately. I heard somebody on social media say alcohol is the only drug that you have to justify not using, which was a huge reframe for me, right? Yeah, like nobody asked you why you didn't do Coke today, right? But you mentioned in the book that if you added up all of the other drugs combined and the crimes that they led to, that it wouldn't even drop a pin in the bucket of what alcohol leads to, which was interesting for me.
Yeah, alcohol is the driver of almost all crimes, whether it's domestic violence, thefts, burglaries. The harder drugs like fentanyl, which is big now, don't even come close to alcohol. Now, alcohol is probably in every household, easy access, it's legal to buy. That's probably part of the reason it's been in our history since.
Yeah, our history. Yeah.
So I think it's out there, but it's really the driver of law enforcement. Where you think all these other drugs are wreaking havoc, by far it's alcohol. There's no doubt.
Yeah, I think so. One of the things that really fascinates me when we get into these conversations is the human behavior behind the conversations, right? As to give you an example, I did a podcast interview with somebody that is a really good friend of mine who, if you stripped away our identities, we were almost the exact same person. We both lost our parents at a young age. I lost my dad at 18. He lost his dad at 18. We both had siblings that looked up to us. We both had a history of suicide in our family. So you could take these dots and you could connect them together and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between us. He went to jail, became a drug addict, almost spent a significant double-digit years in prison. I went to law school. And if you pulled it away, we were running from the same pain. Like my law school, my education, my academic numbing was my trauma response. Yeah. His trauma response was drugs and alcohol. Yet people look at me and they say, what a success you are. And people look at him and say, what a fuck up you are. Yeah. And I've often told my clients in the criminal defense world, the only difference between you and me is, number one, you got caught. And number two, there was this line of what was socially acceptable for me that I wasn't willing to cross. And when you grow up in an environment where those things are accessible, that line doesn't always exist. I grew up in a farming community of 1,800 people. Like committing crimes just wasn't in my psyche, right? My point in telling this story is that every decision we make as business owners, as spouses, as parents is driven by really some of the same trauma that's driving some of the things that you talk about in your book. It's just the decisions we make are socially acceptable, so we don't think about them. How do we start to look at some of these criminals as humans and start to understand that we also have things for ourselves we need to look into? They just happen to do something that we could classify as a crime.
Yeah, and I'll push back a little bit only from my interrogation days with criminals, because I would ask them the same thing. I really want to understand why they committed the crime. And in your life, you took actions. Your actions were a little bit harder. You had to study, you had to focus, you had to commit, you had to be on time. So it was a harder path, even though your social norms were different.
Right.
Some of the actions they take are easier. But when I interview them, they know that they should have done A.
But they chose to do B.
Do B consciously, they chose to do B. It's very hard to get over that hump unless they choose to do this. So most criminals I interviewed absolutely 100% knew at that very moment they were committing a crime. And in their mind, they thought, shit, I better not do this. And they're like, I'm doing it.
I'm doing it.
So very few people, went into that social norm where their parents did it or they saw it. They thought it was okay once in a while. But the vast majority, each and every time, knew they were doing it. And this goes all the way up to even homicide, where they admit they knew they probably shouldn't have committed the murder, but they decided to, and it was what they wanted to do in essence.
Interesting.
So I understand your point, but I think that sometimes we don't give the criminals enough credit on their intelligence. They're there, they're checking in, they know what's right or wrong. They're actively making the decision, because it might be easier to rob a bank and grab 10 grand than go out and work for 6 months for 10 grand. Absolutely.
But your housing's free afterwards.
Well, that's true too, yeah. And most of them, they really don't want to get caught. They're not thinking it through. They're, poor planning. I always tell people the ones that are professionals and think it through, we often don't catch them. There's a lot of criminals we don't catch as cops because they're so professional, we just can't solve the crimes. But I see it both ways, but ultimately the accountability has to be on them, and we've got to find a way to make them accountable. I like the idea of maybe even a military-style boot camp where people would go to and they have to follow orders. I mean, old school, I know constitutionally we don't like to get into that.
Stupid lawyers.
But there are programs for juveniles in Alaska that work extremely well. I know they're under 18, but really they'll go to a military youth academy for a year. They come out a changed kid. They're used to order. They're used to working hard, going to bed on time, studying. I think that's productive, and I think it could be helpful. Not where you're, taking somebody's freedoms away, but you're actually working them, getting them to a point where they can go out in society and be productive. It works for a lot in the juvenile system. I think it could work for adults too.
Yeah, I love that idea. I did an interview with a guy who started a brewery brand called Jailbreak Brewery.
I listened to that one.
Did you?
Yeah.
And I remember talking to him about I think he had said that he had been out for 3 or 4 years, and it was the most he had ever been out of prison as an adult. And I remember asking him, what was that thing? What was the moment that you decided that you weren't coming back into prison, that this was going to be the last time you left? And it entirely an accountability conversation. He said, up until then, it had been my parole officer or my probation officer's fault that I had been caught again. And I had to realize that if I didn't have Coke on me, then my probation officer wouldn't have thrown me back in jail, right? So there's this accountability part that we can't make somebody take. Does it start with that? Like, does it start in a school system of that accountability? Does it start like how we obviously have too many people and too many issues to solve or to save everyone. So where do we start as a society with this accountability piece for not just people convicted of crimes, but for ourselves in our own lives? Because we can look at somebody who's been arrested and that's great, but I can point to a lack of accountability in my business as well. So we all get to focus on this lack of accountability. Where do we start with that?
I mean, I'm going to start at home with my own kids, right? You got to start there, and then school's going to follow through with that. Friends, family is going to follow through, and then you go from there. I think if you lack that in your childhood, and I'm not making excuses for anybody,
Right.
but boy, that's a tough hump to get over as you grow older and you don't have that. So I think accountability at that age, and but I've seen it with juveniles, broken families, dropouts in school. They go down the wrong path. So and they're never forced back into school. Like that always fascinates me. If you're under 18, you should have a requirement to go to school.
Yeah.
But there's not a lot of enforcement there. So we have a lot of lost people that then go out and create havoc on society, where we could have had some interventions and saved them. But boy, parenting's tough, and that gets back to the home, and everybody's got a different opinion on what should or shouldn't happen.
Yeah.
But discipline and accountability as a kid, I think, is good for them.
I think that's important. I was ironically talking to somebody about this today because I grew up in a super small town, farming community, 1,800 people. There's nowhere to hide. My dad died when I was 18. My brothers were 8 and 10. So if they were in Vegas, they're getting lost in a system. Yeah. Whereas in a town of 1,800 people, it really does take a village. And so my mom, who's now this 38-year-old single mother of 2 children, dad went to work one day, didn't come home. Now she's got this community that can come together. And my brother did start having some issues in school, and immediately it was like, this is not your personality. Let's address this as a whole community. And I think you're right. We just can't underestimate the power of having a village of some kind to surround you and to help you.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
So let's dig back into the book for just a little bit. So when you wrote it, it's obviously incredibly entertaining, and it's entertaining for those who really love this true crime element. What was your intention when you wrote it? What are your hopes for the people who read it? What do you want them to take from it?
Yeah, again, it's a different twist on true crime. My first true crime book, there's 1,000 books on serial killers, 1 million books on true crime. So I wanted something that was different. There is no true crime book like this. Gets into the really deviant sexual acts of humanity. So that's the first thing. I wanted something a little bit, off the beaten path for readers. The second thing goes back again to throughout my career telling these stories just to citizens, friends, family, and then really digging into the deviant part of the crime and wanting to know more, asking questions, fascinating me because they weren't law enforcement, but they wanted to know the details. And then really with the book, how I wrote it is, a lot of people think that their sex lives, whether they download porn, whatever sex positions they like is weird, or maybe it's off the charts erotic behavior. When you read this book, you understand that your sex life is perfectly normal. And if it's not, if you relate to this book, you're in some trouble anyway. But that's really what people have taken out of it is that, I thought what I downloaded as my porn search was odd. Once they read this book, they know it's not even on the spectrum of being odd. So that was a positive thing for people, I think, when they read it. The book is a little soft porn. I mean, it's got everything sexual in it, but it's all true crime cases that happened, again, mainly in Alaska. But these cases happened throughout the United States and the world. It's no different being in Alaska for what's in this book.
You know what blew my mind as I was reading the book? First of all, so if you're listening instead of watching and you can't see the book, the name of the book is 50 Shades of True Crime. And it really is 50 Shades of True Crime. That's the best title for it. What blew my mind so much was the amount of things that you talk about that at the time you talked about them weren't actually illegal. And you look at it and you say, but how? Like, how is that not illegal? And then you even talk about some things later in the book in more of the severe, like animal-related conversations where they're like, it's very recent that some of those things happened. And I think it's a reminder for us that we have this morality, and we think that if it's contrary to our morality, that it must be illegal. And there were so many things you talked about that I was like, really? There's no statute for that?
Yeah, that even as a cop, it fascinates you when you have a crime and then you got to search for a statute, or you got to call the district attorney or the prosecutor and say, "Hey, here's what I got," and then they're blown away because they've never heard of this before, and there is no crime. So then what we have to do is write up a police report, forward it to the district attorney, and let the individual go most of the time. Because there's no criminal act or violation. Legislatures then come in and make these criminal post. But I always laugh because criminals always adapt and they find new things. So our criminal codes will always have to be expanding, because as soon as you make one thing criminal, they'll find a way around it, and then you've got to outlaw that as well. But it was interesting, when you're talking about, the book talks about sex with animals, which is a tough subject for people to hear, bestiality. But even to today, not all states have laws preventing bestiality. Alaska took a long time. Hawaii, it took a long time. Whoever opposes this to not enact in law fascinates me, right? Like, what's the argument behind it, not having sex with animals? But it's interesting to me that we still have one U.S. state that doesn't outlaw it.
It's crazy to me. And I think also from a human behavior standpoint, somebody will always surprise you more than you've ever been surprised before. So we could come up with all the laws we wanted to, and somebody's going to do something that you're like, that never even crossed my mind, right? And I think as society gets larger and more brazen and more comfortable with really weird shit, we're going to run into those situations more and more, right? Like, if we went back 200 years, there's no way they would have thought we'd be talking about shit like this.
Yeah, there's no doubt. Always, and even in the beginning of my career, when you had crimes, towards the end of my career, they're entirely different. And it always fascinated me. And 10 years from now, they'll be entirely different than what we're talking about today as far as sex crimes. But they just keep going and expanding and trying different things. And as long as there's criminal acts, there'll be violations. And once you arrest them, they'll create new things to do and test the limits of the law, as you know, as a defense attorney.
Yeah.
That's what they do.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember I had a client once that told me he didn't have any criminal history. And then I do a search and I have to flip pages, right? And I said, I thought you said you didn't have any criminal history. And he's like, well, nobody died. I didn't know that was criminal. And I was like, no serious stuff. And I was like, it's crazy to me how some people define criminal history as like everybody walked away alive, so it must not have been that bad. And it just is, it's nuts to me. So from a reader standpoint, other than entertainment, what are some of the things that you think people can take from this book?
Well, my career, I was the hostage negotiator for most of my career. I had a team. So really, we get into the psyche of individuals when we have a negotiation. Like, we have to get into their mind, learn about them. So as a cop, with all my other cases, I would really do that with criminals. I'd want to understand from their standpoint where they were at in these crimes, especially the sexually deviant crimes, because they fascinated me. There are certainly acts I would not commit. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, there's no spectrum where I'd be there. So I would ask them why, and I reference this in the book. But they actually told me it's not about the sex, the biological act. It's about the power over the victim, and whether that's human, animal, whatever it is. And the book covers it all. It's really that euphoria that they're such in a controlling state that they can dominate that thing. Actually, let's just say thing, because it covers everything. That they get off from that. And that does help them with the act, but really they're thinking about it. And sexual deviants are much like serial killers. They take trinkets and collect things from their victims and relive it later. So it's amazing to get into their psyche, but it's really all about power. When I originally thought it was all about sex.
That's so interesting, because I think understanding the purpose and the intention, one of the phrases we have in NLP when I teach that to business owners is every behavior has an intention. So your decision to organize your Tupperware drawer instead of make your sales calls, there's an intention for that. And it's never that your Tupperware drawer needs to be organized. There's some avoidance going on. There's some protection going on. There's something deeper going on that you're redirecting your attention there. And so that's a different and very same conversation that we can look at this and say, this must be about sex. And you're right. It never is. It's about control and Some people, like, they just they don't feel like they have any control in their own life. And so they want to take control over anything and everything that they can. Where do we go for women who are listening to this from a safety and protection standpoint? Like, obviously, I'm not one to walk around in fear, and I don't suggest anybody else should be either. I live in Vegas. There's no shortage of drug-related sexual assaults. There's no shortage of this fear that you're going to go out to a club and you're going to end up having to worry about how you're going to get home or whether you remember your night. How do we make sure that we're staying safe?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite questions, and I have two daughters, so I'll tell you what I told them growing up, is that always trust your gut. In law enforcement, in all my cases where there were victims, 95% of them knew something was wrong. It was odd, but they went along with it, or they didn't stop it because they thought it would be okay. So first off, just trust your gut. Most of the time, you're going to understand that it's an odd situation, whether it's somebody trying to, say, come with me, check this out in a dark alley or in an empty parking garage, whatever it is, right? Trust your gut. Separate yourself from that, walk away. There is 5% where you can't stop it, right? Somebody comes up with a gun, somebody abducts you. It's hard. In those instances, I tell all women to fight because if they're going to kill you there, they're certainly going to kill you elsewhere. It's going to be much worse, right? Most of them will leave because they don't want to create a scene right there. They'll go and find a victim that doesn't resist. So one, follow your gut is key. And two is if you get into a situation where somebody's trying to abduct you, knife, gun, doesn't matter, you have to fight. Because where you go, typically in 2 hours, the victim's a murder victim. That's really the span if we don't find you within 2 hours. And to be honest, it's going to be very hard for law enforcement to find you in 2 hours. We may not even get the call till the next day if you're abducted. If nobody sees it, to track phones, things like that. And it's by far too late. So you got to protect yourself. Police are out there, they can help, but individuals have to protect themselves. So follow your gut. That's really important. And most people can think back to situations where they didn't follow their gut and it turned out bad. And afterwards they're like, I knew it. I thought about this before, especially in safety issues, follow your gut.
I think it's interesting because one of the things that we deal with when we're talking about human programming is what's been passed down to us genealogically. And the stereotypical women programming is don't ruffle feathers, is take care of everybody else before you take care of yourself, right? That people pleaser runs deep. And I remember somebody saying to me once, I would rather be wrong and labeled an asshole than right and dead. Right. And I think that mainstream entertainment, not necessarily media, but entertainment, TV shows, movies, has wildly overestimated how quickly law enforcement can act. So, I can't tell you how many times I had a client or a victim say, or even a client say, there's got to be video of this happening. And I'm like, well, first of all, I'm sure there is somewhere. Second of all, good luck finding it. And third of all, the casino isn't handing it over to you, even if it happened on casino property, because there's so much shit on that they don't want you to know or see. So there's no way they're going to give it to you. So I think that that's one of the things that is huge, is that there's this disservice done with this belief that DNA exists in every case and video exists in every case and cops can act on the drop of a hat.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. You got to protect yourself. I tell everybody that. I would give talks to community councils, citizens academies. I would tell them that. You got to protect your alarms in your house, lock your doors. We'll get there. It's going to take some time. Most people have cell phones. So for women out there that somebody says, I need help, come with me, help me, certainly get on the phone, call. You're helping them, call it in, but don't go into closed houses, apartments, cars with an individual you don't know. You can help them, but just call on the phone to get some help for them. Yeah. You don't have to do it. I know everybody wants to help, and I think that's a good thing for humanity, but it is dangerous out there, and you got to protect yourself first while helping them get help. You can call somebody else to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a brand, and I can't remember what it is right now. They're local to Las Vegas. I'll tag it in the show notes when I figure it out. And they've created these lipstick containers that a regular sized lipstick will fit in. And in the bottom, if you unscrew it, there's testing strips that you can put in your drink to see if GHB has been added to it. And so you can pull that out and test it before you take a drink. And then the bottom is also a button, and you can customize what that button is. So it can play a sound, or it can call a family or friend, or can do whatever it is. And I thought that was such a brilliant idea for women to have.
I hadn't heard of that. What I would say is at a bar, make sure your drinks, you watch the bartender make them and pass them. I reference a case in the book on where they would take GHB, freeze it in ice cubes, and then put it in your drink. And the problem with that, if you did the strip immediately, may not be detectable.
Yeah.
And then you're like, I'm good. And as those ice cubes melt, you become a victim. So my advice, although those are always good backups, is to watch your drink being made and then get it from the bartender who's making all the other drinks. Just to be safe, because you just never know.
Yeah. One of the things I loved, I'm a huge believer in expanding your perception in all environments. And my real life examples of this is obviously coming from a farming community and becoming a defense attorney in Vegas. And I remember looking at some of my clients who would get roughed up in the detention facility, or they would tell me some of the life experiences they've had on the street. And I would think there is no way that's possible, right? And then you experience it, and politically, regardless of political opinion, part of our problem right now is that people don't take the time to expand their perception and understanding of the other side, right? So since it's outside of their awareness of what they relate to and understand, they can't fathom how somebody could have an opinion other than that. So I'm one of the things I love about the book so much is that it really does expand your perception of this like sexual spectrum, right? But then it also, I come from a world of curiosity. Like, I just want to ask questions. I want to have conversations. I want to know more. And it really puts you in a situation where people say, I never knew that my neighbor would be like that. But part of it is that we never asked questions, right? We never took time to get to know our neighbor. Granted, there's always the one that's going to hide it. There's always the one that you'd never know, no matter what happened, that comes to the barbecues. But for the most part, we just don't ask enough questions. And when we do, we'd start to realize something's not adding up here.
That's true. There'd be little hints or signs.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you learn, we come from different lifestyles, defense attorney, cop. So we're engrossed in it 24/7. So you kind of learn it. When I was a cop, first started being a cop, I was a little green behind the ears. And for your listeners, that just means you're like a rookie newbie.
Yeah.
And I didn't get half of it. I mean, the light bulb just wasn't clicking on how deviant humanity could be. And then one day, about 6 months later, it clicked on. And then, not that my job was easier, but I understood it. I knew what to look for. Because I always, I came from a pretty sheltered background. I always thought the good in everybody. My mom was old school and, very professional. Everybody's good. And most people are good, but there's, I tell people there's 10% of society that wreaks 90% of the crime. Just that little, number that does all the crime. Most of society is good. So I hate to paranoid the listeners on if you go to bars, drinks, basically just keep yourself safe, right?
Yeah.
Be aware of what's around you. As a cop, as a retired cop, I do the same thing, right? I'm aware of my surroundings, where I get my drinks. Not that typically males aren't going to be victims of that, but I'm still cognizant of it. I watch, especially for my wife or my kids. I think it's important. So you don't have to be paranoid. Just have a little alertness. That's all you need. You'll avoid much of it.
Well, and I want to make this comment as we start to wrap up, because we're talking about some really sick, disgusting crimes that have been committed. And I think the majority of people will thankfully never experience what that's like. We have obviously with the Me Too movement and with us understanding and being less tolerant of comments, you might have more of a sexual harassment conversation. But the things that you talk about in the book, the vast majority of people will never experience. And that's a good thing. But I think the human behavior behind it is something that we experience every day. Somebody wanting control over us, somebody lying to us, somebody manipulating us. And whether it is signing a business deal, whether it's picking a business partner, whether it's going out on a date or picking a romantic partner, like these human behavior conversations are things that we need to have. And that's one of the things I really appreciated about your book, was even though the examples that you use in there are extreme and vile, and some of them made my stomach turn, some of it was hard to read. Yeah. Seeing the intention and the behavior behind it, if we took the surface level, which is the action, and we looked at what was the intention behind it, we can see that in all of our everyday lives. And then that becomes the conversation of the way we deal with this in a business setting is the same way that we deal with it in a victim setting. It's just the consequences are higher, the outcome's worse.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Since I was a negotiator for so long, I use negotiations in everyday life, right? Whether it's my businesses that I've run, whether it's a board service that I'm on, or even interacting with your family, sometimes you have to be a negotiator. So I think that it all correlates, different levels, right? I mean, some of these are extreme, like you said in the book. I don't leave anything out of the book. It's as raw as it gets.
Yes, it is.
But I'll tell you, you get to go from start to finish on these individuals, see what happens with them post. Some of these crimes you would have never even thought about.
Almost all of them.
Yeah. And some people know the big ones in there, but there'd be some that they're like, wow, I never even would have thought of that. So again, it's just to expand your mind a little bit on true crime and come out with a little different flavor.
Yeah, and what I will say to those of you who are listening who are really excited to check this book out, I will just say don't order a pizza before you read it. I will, yeah. And in order to find out what that means, you need to get the book and read it, because you would not believe me if I told you. So
yeah, I haven't ordered takeout pizza since that call.
Don't blame you.
Now I love pizza, but either I'm going to make it myself or I'm going to watch it be oven baked and then delivered to me. But I've never had a delivery pizza since that.
Oh,
I think most of your listeners won't either.
Yeah, it's absolutely insane.
Yeah.
So what are you doing now? Do you still work in law enforcement?
Retired in law enforcement, wrote the book. What was kind of a cool thing is I did a previous podcast, and then I had a production company out of California contact me that wants to do a docuseries, reference some of these true crimes.
Yeah.
So currently working through that. So we'll see how that goes. You know, they sell it to either Netflix, Hulu, depending if they get somebody to fill the budget. So you might have some real Alaska true crimes coming to TV soon. So that's kind of the next thing, and then just enjoying life.
Well, let's end this on a good note. So where should people go if they're going to go visit Alaska? Because I don't want to make them think Alaska is this horrible place they shouldn't go to. Yeah. So where should they go visit? It's
so, I mean, the beauty is unbelievable. The mountains, the majesty of Alaska, I talk about it. I visit all over the world, but really I'm always happy to be home because it's so beautiful. I would say the cruise is cool, very affordable, because Alaska can be spendy to go up and stay in hotels, but people love the cruise along our coastline. If you're going to fly into Anchorage, you can go up to Denali, which is our large mountain. There's Talkeetna, which is a beautiful area. You can visit Fairbanks. The state's massive. You can drive 8-10 hours. You're still right in the middle of the state.
Wow.
But I would go May through August. That's our summertime. So you get into the 70s. You won't have to deal with snow. See a lot of wildlife is everywhere. So I'd go through there, drive around if you can. If you're on a budget, I think the cruise is the best way, most affordable. But if you want to do interior, definitely go to Denali. You can do plane rides. You can land on the glacier on the mountain. You can tour it. You can do wildlife excursions. Absolutely go to Alaska before you die. It's incredible. You don't want to miss out. It's not that far. Especially Vegas, I think it's a 4 or 5 hour flight.
Yeah.
So get up there and check it out. It's absolutely amazing.
That's awesome. And lastly, where can people find the book and where can they connect with you?
Yeah, the book, you can go to my website, it's dougfifer.com. That's just FIFER.com. You can watch the book trailer too before you buy it if you want. And then there's links. It's everywhere. It's on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles. Anywhere books are sold, you can find the book. You can also request on the website for an author signed book if you want, or as a gift, I'm more than happy to send it out for you too.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming in and doing this interview. It was great to do it in person. Virtual interviews are great, but there's nothing like an in-person connection. So I appreciate you taking the time to come out for it.
Thanks for having me. I'm going to go donate some money to Las Vegas now.
I love it. You're the reason we don't have state income tax.
That is true.
Donate away.
All right, I will.
So.